Hello, my name is Ruby Ranson, and today I will be discussing my research on Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley was a black dressmaker, designer, philanthropist, and activist during the latter half of the 19th century. Keckley held a profoundly unique position as someone who had been born enslaved, eventually coming to fully recognize the power of her own labor and using it to purchase her own freedom and achieve economic self-sufficiency, fully exercising the extent of her social mobility. Her expert craftsmanship as a seamstress earned her business and renown. She had working relationships with much of the white upper-class elite in D.C. As a black woman in the 1860s, they respected her value as a laborer more than anything else. For some time, Keckley has gone unnoticed in the annals of American history. Symptomatic of the intentional erasure employed in the post-Reconstruction process and its focus on suppressing the history of slavery. Following the end of her service in the White House, she published her memoir, Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, for which she received major public backlash. She was publicly slandered and discredited. This resulted in her written word, designs, and any historical awareness of her work fading into temporary obscurity. However, more recent scholarship, beginning in the 1980s, has begun to address the lack of concentration on Keckley's narrative, though much of this work has been done in the field of literary studies. Her narrative is often read for details about the lives of the Lincolns, which has left her own story overshadowed at times. These Lincoln-centric analyses fail to situate Keckley in the scope of 19th century American politics, which gives no justice to her work and impact. In neglecting her personal narrative, we lose an important understanding and account of Keckley's nuanced experiences from enslavement to freedom. I am deeply indebted to the works of historians Tavolia Glimpf and Tara W. Hunter. Firstly, Glimpf's work, Out of the House of Bondage, overturned one integral concept that has pervaded Southern women's history: the idea that white and black women had more in common based on gender alone than white women did ideologically with their male counterparts. Secondly, Glimpf's work was integral in forming my understanding of the important role white women played in maintaining the private sphere, which upheld hierarchies of race and gender across the U.S. in the 19th century, as well as black women's active role in destroying that sphere during and after the Civil War. Keckley, too, in publishing her memoir, dismantled the private-public distinction. White women as much as white men were committed to upholding hierarchies of race after the Civil War, and Glimpf's work shows how those ideologies that began in the plantation household translated to a post-emancipation world. Glimpf also documents the myriad of ways that black women declared their freedom on their own terms, and often these declarations were related to clothing, much like Keckley's. Tara W. Hunter's work also illuminates the ways that women as domestic workers asserted their own boundaries around their work and time, just as Keckley did. Both of these works aim to write social histories of larger groups of women, often underrepresented in the historical narrative, and cites many sources, reading them against the grain to uncover their stories. While Keckley's life remains well documented in comparison to the women that Hunter and Glimpf discuss, she was also faced with defining freedom on her own terms against a system that saw her as only a skilled laborer. As scholar Jamora Santamarina said, Keckley's life forged a new space for black femininity that encompassed the incompatible domains of antebellum womanhood and labor. Before I continue my presentation, I would like to note that while I do not say it and have chosen to blur it out, this presentation discusses sources that use the N-word and also discusses violence against black women and enslaved persons. I will now discuss Keckley's life experience during the antebellum period and the conditions that allowed her to gain her freedom. Keckley was born Elizabeth Hobbs to her enslaved mother, Agnes Hobbs, and her enslaver, Colonel Burwell, in 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. Being half white and half black constituted Keckley's status as a mulatto slave, which afforded her the limited privilege of learning to read and write, but it was her enslaved mother who would teach her how to sew, the skill which she ultimately made use of to acquire the means to her and her son's freedom. These exceptions did not protect her from the horrors of slavery. As a child, she was beaten and witnessed her uncle hang himself for fear of punishment. These events emboldened her hatred for the institution. She was raped at the age of 18 in 1836, leading to the birth of her son George. Prior to that, in 1832, at the age of 14, she had moved closer to Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg had a large free black population at the time, mainly made of manumitted free women of color who worked as domestic workers. She was then sent to Hillsborough, North Carolina until 1847, when she then moved to St. Louis, Missouri, another city with a large free black female population. For the next 12 years, Keckley would work as a seamstress, intermingling with free women of color, as well as white patrons, who she would eventually call on to vouch for her character. As was customary but not written into law in attaining her freedom through legal means in 1855. Keckley understood that in order to gain her freedom and remain employed, she had to cater to the expectations of upper-class whites at the time. After finally paying off the $1,200 that it cost to free herself and her son in 1860, she moved to Washington, D.C., and using her connections from St. Louis, became the dressmaker to many prominent Southern women. During her time working as Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, and dressmaker to many prominent women at the time, Keckley experienced a short period of minor celebrity. As one reporter noted in 1862, "Stately carriages stand before her door, whose haughty owners sit before Lizzie, docile as lambs, while she tells them what to wear," clearly exemplifying the respect of her merit as a modiste and a small reversal of power. In that same year, she also started the Contraband Relief Association, which helped supply newly freed slaves under the Confiscation Acts with work, shelter, clothing, and food. Keckley was able to use her connections to create a network of donors to accomplish her plan, including Mary Todd Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. This act exhibits Keckley's true political beliefs. While she was not outspoken like her friends Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, she used her intimate and stately position to economically aid the goals that she could not publicly express while working as a dressmaker. She spent much of the rest of her time working intimately with the Lincolns, becoming deeply involved in their daily lives during the war. In 1868, Elizabeth Keckley wrote and published Behind the Scenes. However, she never saw a dime in sales profits. Keckley intended to write a memoir that absolved both Mary Todd Lincoln and herself of all public misconstruing of their dealings during their time in the Oval Office. It also showed the progression of what her labor afforded both herself and others. However, included in Keckley's narrative are intimate letters detailing the specifics of Mary Todd Lincoln's old clothes scandal. Allegedly, Keckley did not want to include these letters herself, but they were added by her editor in the hope of selling it as a gossip piece. After reading Keckley's memoir and noting, in her eyes, the clear exposure of her private life, Mary Todd Lincoln dismissed Elizabeth Keckley's friendship almost immediately. Friendship was the term that they both used for their relationship. In a private letter dated after its publication, Todd Lincoln refers to Keckley as, quote, the colored historian. While Mary Todd Lincoln's prerogative here is to clearly discredit Keckley's views based on her race, she also chooses to use the word historian to define Keckley's account, which ironically corroborates its authenticity from a modern perspective. Keckley and Mary Todd Lincoln's relationship is but one relationship that can help us understand the dependency that white America had on the lives and labors of black people, and the clear but more specific dependence on black domestic female workers. It was Keckley's skill as a dressmaker that allowed these women to appear in the newest fashions to achieve airs of white femininity. Moreover, it was Keckley's written word that aided in dismantling the very same image of white femininity they clung to by revealing her essential part in her ability to exemplify it. This shattering of the illusion of the farce of white femininity occurs as a revelation of the contradiction between the presentation of white femininity and the lack of action behind the facade. For as long as Keckley had remained a silent observer, refraining from the assertion of the authority she clearly possessed, she was revered and accepted by prominent whites for her skill alone. And behind the scenes, Keckley's authorial voice challenged the firmly entrenched social expectation that members of the black workforce should remain silent and invisible contributors to the American economy. Hence, once she spoke out, she was categorically rejected for transgressing the bounds of her prescribed place in white society, which constituted a threat to the ideological authority of her oppressors. Beyond what Mary Todd Lincoln thought of it, the reception of her memoir represented entrenched ideas of racism that sunk their roots deep into the consciousness of white America. 3 months after its publication, David Ottolenghi, a white Jewish American Southerner from Charleston, published a racist satire mocking Keckley's earnest work. Entitled Behind the Scenes, this work rewrites Keckley's narrative. Behind the Scenes is written through the character Bitsy Keckley and aims to minimize her credibility and humanity. Elizabeth Keckley's mainstream anonymity can be attributed to a multitude of factors which ultimately center around the manifold realizations of racial anxieties that she provoked in each level of white America through the publication of her memoir. To the poor white Americans, she existed as a narrative of black success, reaching far beyond the typical Southern white male. She existed as an entity to be loathed in the wake of a war that destroyed the comfort of black subjugation for white Southerners. She served as proof that a black woman could, on merit alone, attain prominence and respect within the highest circles. She could acquire access to the single most important private sphere in the country, and so she existed as a direct contradiction to the idea of innate white superiority, a comfort that even the poorest whites could cling to. For the American white elite, Keckley represented a risk to their security, an expose on the ambiguities left in deliberate obscurity. She revealed the mundane aspects of their privilege, of their private comings and goings, and of the nuance and flaws of their esoteric livelihoods. What was triggered in Oda Langley's piece was an attack on Keckley's credibility and humanity in order to delegitimize all elements of her story. Behind the Scenes was a gratuitous 20-page pamphlet laden with over-sexualization and racist tropes. It illuminated in such explicit character sentiments of explicit white supremacist ideological rhetoric pervasive in the nation, which the white elite preferred to draw attention away from in the public sphere to protect themselves from exposure. Behind the Scenes was, as Glimp noted, apolitical and destructive, meaning that American politics did not leave room for accepting the exposed intimacy that Keckley demonstrated in her book. The fact that she was a black woman speaks to the nature of the hatred attracted by her publication, as well as the bolstered impact that her public disparagement resulted in. Her narrative so deeply attacked the public-private distinction upheld by prominent whites in the 19th century that she lost her prominent clients, and soon after her business. Until the end of her life, to quote Fleischner, her autobiographer, Keckley paid for her frank exposure of the Lincolns' private affairs and personal letters, falling into poverty after losing her prosperous dressmaking business in the face of public scorn. Keckley threatened hierarchies of race and gender and class at the time, exposing their intersections. The only just way to end this presentation is with a reflection of Elizabeth Keckley's life in her own words. On April 6, 1901, journalist Smith D. Fry published an interview with Keckley where she states, "The people whom I personally served seem to have forsaken me, but the government has not overlooked me. My only son was a soldier and died for liberty. The government gives me a small pension. Thereby, I am able to pay my room rent. If I had one single friend who would ask Congress to relieve me, I know that they would give me a liberal pension, because God knows I served my country while I was in the White House, and I helped Mrs. Lincoln, in her darkest days of subsequent poverty. I looked after her interests and helped her to raise money when she was in dire distress. Then I was strong and vigorous. I had no fear of the future. I believed in my ability to take care of myself, and it never occurred to me that I would likely be forgotten and forsaken. I made no provision for old age, for I did not know ingratitude." That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.